Alright, so this is the Preonic by Drop and OLKB, originally designed by Jack Humbert. It is a 50% ortholinear custom mechanical keyboard sold on drop.com. As of recording this video, the Preonic keyboard is listed at $140 US, but I purchased this over the holidays for a discounted price of $115. I think it's a great entry-level custom mechanical keyboard, especially for those who want to actually game on their keyboards, because that was the biggest criticism I had with the Planck, was that the lack of a number row just made it impossible to game on, but this one has one, and it's really been my go-to for gaming ever since I put it together. First, I'm going to talk about the whole experience of receiving and putting together and using the Preonic, then move on to a little bit of a comparison between the Preonic and the Planck side by side. So the Preonic unboxing experience is pretty standard, comes from a very similar box to the Planck, and I personally didn't come across any problems with shipping or anything like that. The first thing we get is a little user manual or guide that gives you some of the key bindings for the Preonic, as well as an installation guide printed onto the manual, but I do recommend looking at their video tutorials instead. Next is the aluminum case. The case is quite heavy. It's a nice decent weight, mainly because it's just a huge block of aluminum, but it's definitely a nice change of feel if you're coming from a keyboard that is of a plastic casing. Next are the cables and screws. I actually assembled the Preonic keyboard with what's known as the loose plate method, which doesn't use all of the screws. That's also listed in the user manual. Then there was the stainless steel plate, as well as the PCB. This PCB is outfitted with hot swap sockets, which are compatible with Cherry MX and Kale style switches. You can also use Matthias Alp switches, but that does require that you do solder in the switches. The PCB supports a handful of different layouts, mainly regarding whether you want to go with a full grid or one 2U spacebar or two 2U spacebars, and is outfitted with a USB Type-C port. If you watched my rotary encoder guide for the OLKB Planck, you'll remember that I mentioned where the hot swap sockets that support rotary encoders are located, and I'm showing that right now, where these white squares are showing you what slots are actually compatible with soldering on a rotary encoder. On the drop.com page for the Preonic kit, you also have the choice of adding in a carrying case as well as a basic keycap set, which should cover all of your bases for accessories. I decided to go with a linear switch by Novel Keys, known as their cream switches, and I actually took the time to hand lubricate them. So what does it mean to have a different type of mechanical keyboard switch? So you could kind of break down mechanical keyboard switches into three main categories: linears, tactiles, and clicky switches. And each of these will give you a different sound and feel when you use them. The tactile feedback that you get from typing on a mechanical keyboard is a really integral part of why mechanical keyboards are so popular, and choosing a type of switch that meets your preferences and tastes is a really big part of what makes a keyboard appealing to you specifically. So a linear switch is a switch that has no tactile bump and no audible click, other than when the switch bottoms out and tops up at the end of the stroke. A tactile switch has a small tactile bump that you'll feel when you press down on the switch, and can have a variance in noise profile depending on which kind of tactile switch you get. A clicky switch, as you can tell from the name, makes an audible clicking sound whenever you press down on it. The difference between a tactile switch and a clicky switch is usually that a clicky switch has a built-in mechanism to deliberately create more sound than just the actuation of the switch itself. Within each of these categories are many different kinds of switches switches, and some enthusiasts are even mixing and matching different parts to make Franken switches that are completely unique and have completely unique properties. I would say in general, the best course of action to deciding what switch you'd like is to order a switch tester, which is a tiny pad with a few different types of switches to find out which ones you like the most. So, switch lubing. It's kind of a weird concept if you're new to the world of custom mechanical keyboards, but it's something that a lot of people in the community swear by in order to improve their custom mechanical keyboard experience, or even as a way to bring new life into pre-built keyboards that they've had in their collection. Switch lubing requires you to take apart every single switch that you plan on using in your keyboard and either use some technique to apply a thin layer of lubricant on all of them at once, or the typical method is to use a very thin, fine paintbrush and hand lube each switch, making sure that you're basically coating all of the areas where the switch has friction or any source of rattling to change the tactile feel of the switch, as well as change the sound profile of the switch. While personally I didn't find the act of hand lubing switches to be too bad, it's certainly not for everybody. It requires a fair bit of dexterity and can be quite fiddly, but to me and a lot of other people, it's quite worth the end result. So at first glance, the Planck and the Preonic look pretty similar, but once you actually start observing some of the details in terms of the way that the chassis is built and the way that the case looks, there are quite a few differences. Something that stuck out to me was actually the way that the USB-C port on both of the PCBs are housed by the case. You could see that the Planck has an open cutout at the bottom, whereas the Preonic board has a enclosed sort of cutout for the USB-C port. I think in the past, some people have reported that the USB-C port for the Planck in specific can be prone to damage, but from what I've gone through in terms of unplugging them and plugging them in and just normal wear and tear, there hasn't really been any structural issues with my unit specifically. So I think the design of the cutout is really just something that comes down to preference. The bezels for the Preonic are actually quite a bit thicker, I would say about 3 times thicker than the case for the Planck keyboard. And something to keep in mind is that the Preonic keyboard only comes as a high profile case, whereas the Planck comes with the choice of a mid profile or high profile, depending on availability. The purple case that I ordered for this board actually kind of came out as a sort of washed out bluish gray. So just keep that in mind if you're considering getting the purple color. You might get something more vibrant if you choose a different colored case. So there you have it. The lubed cream switches honestly just sound fantastic. This isn't a review of the keyboard switches, but I think they go really well with this keyboard. So that basically wraps it up for the review of the drop-in OLKB Preonic. I think it's a great starter board for someone who wants to experience an ortholinear board while having something that's under $200 even without a discount. If you want to see more keyboard related content in the future, whether that be another keyboard kit or a switch review, let me know in the comments, especially if you have any questions. And don't forget, subscribe, ring the bell. That way you can be one of the first people to know when I come out with a new video. See you guys next time.